that are the emperors, and to God, the things that are God's. Well, that's it. It's that simple. Or is it? These words of Jesus are often quoted. We've probably all heard them many, many times. But their meaning is pretty elusive. Historically, in the time of Jesus, Rome occupied the Holy Land, Israel in that area, and imposed an annual tax on the Jews. And some, especially the temple authorities, were okay with that. In fact, they figured Israel was much safer under the protection of Rome, and so were their jobs. But others deeply and bitterly opposed both the tax and the occupation. So that's the background. This was a loaded situation that Jesus stumbled into that day. The lines were drawn. And if you notice in the reading, both the Herodians, who represented one party, and the Pharisees, another, they were all there listening to see what this man named Jesus could say. And so the coin in the gospel reading is also very significant. It had an image on it, an image card of Caesar. And this was very controversial, especially among the Jews who believed that such images were terrible, not just inappropriate, but awful. So awful that not all coins in the Jewish area had inscriptions on them. Herod the Great, who was likely alive when Jesus was born and died soon after, and his son, Herod Antipas, created plain coins that did not carry this image of Caesar upon them because they knew how the Jews felt, and they did it out of deference to Jewish law. And so thereby, when Jesus elicited this coin with Caesar's image on it from these people standing around him asking these questions, already the politics were at work here. Because there would have been some in the crowd who would have been very upset that these Pharisees, these holy men, were carrying around coins with Caesar's image. Lots going on in this little conversation. Well, the question asked of Jesus was, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? A really loaded question. And it was intended to trap him. If he said yes, he would be seen as favoring collaboration with Rome. And if he said no, he could be accused of treason. So Jesus responded with a very peculiar answer. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, while the context of that account was a confrontation, and that's what's really going on here. These were not people really wanting to know much. They were confronting Jesus. It was not a studied question. Still, it raises an important consideration. It might be put this way. What belongs to God and what belongs to the empire? I use the word empire in a broad sense, in the sense that we live in empires. What belongs to God and what belongs to the empire? Sometimes we're fond of saying, even putting on our license plate and on our currency, in God we trust. Very popular slogan. You drive down the road, you get behind a lot of cars, and on the bottom of that Georgia license plate, it says, in God we trust. But what does that mean exactly when it comes to deciding what belongs to God and what belongs to the empire? And I think that's a very difficult task to be about, making that determination. And we're not always very good at it. We are conditioned by our backgrounds to see things the way we've been taught. something that more likely belongs to Caesar. Now, in the South, we did that for a long, long time with slavery. We argued that God ordained slavery, that this was from the wrath of God. Well, perhaps we really weren't trusting enough in God. Perhaps we were more concerned with the empire's laws and how they affected our cultural and economic beliefs. Well, we've learned a lot over the years. And some would argue that debates about gay marriage cover some of the same ground. We are presupposed to attribute to God the values with which we identify. So, this gets more complicated as we go along. Give to the empire the things that are the empire's, and to God the things that are God's. We may find ourselves sometimes caught between those two. I suspect, and I hope we find ourselves caught between those two, because that's where important decision making is made. For example, what does God's justice and concern for all creation demand of us? God's love and concern for all people, what does it demand of us? And what does the free market economy demand? Now, there's some rubbing going on in those two demands. And so how do we deal with the conflicts between these demands? The temptation may be to limit the wrath of God to heavenly things, or to say that the economy is just a matter of business. It's just business. But then can we truly say, in God we trust? Following Jesus is much more demanding and much more difficult than putting a bumper sticker on a car or writing a check to a political campaign. In order to discern what belongs to which realm, we usually need to stretch ourselves. We usually need to think deeply and look around. Posturing and refusing to listen to others is not a helpful way to begin this kind of discernment. In some of the new authorized prayer book literatures, after the reading, the lector says, "Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church." Now, I like that. I like it because it presents us with a task. It gives us a job to do. We're called upon to discern what God is saying through the Scriptures. What is God saying to us? And that task, moreover, is corporate. It's not a private matter. It is a common call to all who will listen. What is the Spirit saying to the church? Perhaps discerning what belongs to God and what belongs to the empire is a lot like that. We're called to the task of listening to God. We're called to the task of listening to what the Spirit is saying. When we listen corporately as the body in this way, then we listen as the church prayerfully and with open hearts and open minds, we may find that what we thought clearly belonged to one realm actually belongs to the other. There was a story this past week on an Atlanta television station, a newscast, about a local attorney, Edward Buckley, who has raised over $350,000 for clean water projects in Haiti. These are all private donations. These are not corporate donations. $350,000 for clean water projects in Haiti. Now, it happens that Ed is a good friend of mine and former parishioner. And I know how passionate he is about providing clean water. He believes that clean water is a human right, and that we need to honor that right. Ed is a brilliant attorney. He's regularly sought after for some very high-profile cases in our state. He knows the laws of the empire. He works with them every day. But Ed also knows that there is a greater law, a more important realm. And as I watched that telecast, I thought of how Ed has been able to maintain, with all the pressures around him, to maintain a faithful and a positive attitude. Whereas he could have focused on himself. He could have focused on self-gain. And simply discounted largely the needs of others. But he hasn't done that because he's worked very hard to determine what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. And no doubt some of you, and perhaps many of you, are about the same task. You're doing that. And I think that that is a major work of Christian discipleship. To struggle with that, the tensions around what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar. As we, as Christians, seek to disentangle these two realms, it's helpful, I think, to see God's realm as the larger circle and Caesar's realm as the smaller circle inside the larger circle. Now, these circles are always in tension. That's part of living. You know, the whole story of the Bible is about this tension. There's always tension there for us. And actually, these two realms need each other. Because we need that realm of empire, that realm of Caesar, in order to have order, in order to operate in the world. We need that. But the smaller realm of Caesar, what belongs to Caesar, needs always to be guided by the larger realm of what belongs to God. That is so important. It is so important that inner circle not be isolated from the larger circle. Because when it becomes separated, when it becomes isolated from that, things begin to break down. And sooner or later come serious consequences. I think back to Hitler's round in the 1930s and the 1940s, where you can track that whole breakdown, where this larger round was put aside. It was only mentioned in terms of propaganda. It was only mentioned in terms of paying lip service. But in reality, that round was being neglected. So some things belong to God, and some things belong to Caesar. For us, we proclaim that we belong to Jesus. God's realm always takes priority. It is our common